Hi, I'm Ben Yallow. I am the moderator for this panel, which is Fandom Check-In, Where Are We At? We are going to be discussing what's been happening in the world of fandom. And following up on that, we'll be discussing where we think things are going to be going. So I would now like to let the panel introduce themselves. We will do it in alphabetical order, which means, Foz, I believe you are first.
Okay, hello. I'm Foz Meadows. I'm an Australian author, fan writer, general yeller on the internet who currently lives in California, but not the part that's currently on fire. And yeah, I won Best Fan Writer last year at the Hugo Awards, which was fantastic, and written a few books, working on some other stuff now, and yeah, prone to yelling about fandom a lot, basically.
Isabel?
I'm Isabel Schechter. My pronouns are she and her. I have been in fandom now for 20 years. 10 of those, I was a convention runner. I have recovered from that and escaped. I also live in California, the part that is not burning. I am, however, from the Midwest. You can take the girl out of Chicago, can't take the Chicago out of the girl. That was where I got my start in convention running. I've been a panelist at all sorts of conventions. I tend to go to conventions that are 1,000 attendees and more. I go to a lot of world cons. I was even the co-chair of the bid to bring the NASFiC to San Juan, Puerto Rico in 2017. And I write essays and recently edited. I write a lot of essays about race and representation in science fiction and fantasy. And I just recently edited an anthology of essays about bridges and borders that we create in science fiction, specifically focusing on WizCon, which is a feminist science fiction convention.
Nicholas?
Yep, Nicholas Weiss, my pronouns are he, him. I was the Hugo administrator last year and 3 years ago for Helsinki, and the deputy Hugo administrator this year. I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland originally. I've lived in Belgium for 21 years. I've been going to conventions about as long as that as well. I guess the other thing to say is in my day job, I'm a political consultant, lobbyist in the Brussels bubble. So I sort of try and bring a science fictional approach to politics and a slightly political approach to science fiction.
And I'm Ben Yallow, he, him. I've been going, well, this last Worldcon last month was my 50th Worldcon. I'm up to 800 some odd conventions, probably worked on 300 of them. I worked at everything from a gopher level up to division head chairman staff for a Worldcon. I've chaired a few regionals, co-founded SMOFCon, which is a convention runners convention that's been roaming around the world for the last almost 4 decades. So I've been around for a while. And at this stage, I think we'll start with setting the scenery. Where are we at? So, Foz, what are your highlights for this year?
Does anyone truly have highlights for 2020? Or do they have things that they've survived?
Things that they point to and say, boy, that's awfully 2020-ish.
Well, I think fandom-wise, 2020 sort of got kicked off by the whole collapse of the Romance Writers Association of America meltdown over Courtney Milan, and I can't even recap the drama of that sufficiently, but that was sort of like, that was January, which feels approximately 9,000 years ago at this point. And everything has kind of unspooled from there. and I have been taking solace in watching Chinese fantasy dramas subsequently. So that's sort of wider fandom and personal fandom is where I'm at the moment. But yeah, there's been a lot going on this year, and if we're counting from this August back to the last August to the last Worldcon, last Worldcon as in 2019 and Worldcon 2020, there's some definite things that happened at both of those conventions that we could talk about in terms of broader fandom, and doubtless we'll talk about.
Isabel?
So there were two things I think that really stuck out for me. Was the American Dirt controversy, which didn't have to do with fandom. It didn't start out in fandom, but it carried over into fandom because a lot of the authors that were very vocal about that actually happened to be science fiction authors. So that was the start of the year. And then most recently was the Hugo debacle, the Hugo Awards ceremony, the whole George R.R. Martin thing. But that could just be a whole panel unto itself, really. So that one, I don't know if it's because it's the most recent or because it was the most horrific, but that one is really the one that sticks out for me.
Nicholas?
Yeah, well, I was rather intimately involved with the counting of the Hugo votes, but not with the award ceremony. Indeed, I think Foz actually counted the votes that gave you your Hugo Award last year, so I can claim some credit for that. Well, the voters get more credit. But yeah, I mean, that was a particularly striking point for me, I must say. I mean, we had put months into our effort, and then to find that the work we had put in was subverted by the way in which the ceremony was delivered was deeply disappointing, and that's putting it very, very mildly indeed. I think apart from that and the romance writers thing, which was just utterly incredible, I would say let's look a bit more broadly at what's been happening while we've been in the pandemic situation. And there's been a sort of, what are we looking at? What are we all enjoying together? And I think there's been one or two sort of shows that have come out that we've all really, that I've sensed some kind of buy-in from friends. The one at the moment that I'm really getting, or the two at the moment, I should say, both started in the last week or so, Star Trek Lower Decks and Lovecraft Country, both of which a large chunk of my Facebook feed seems to be deeply invested, and frankly I am too. And that's a rather nice thing where we've had this rather grim moment where the Hugos, which should have brought us together, didn't quite manage to do that. Nonetheless, we've still got the media coming through, and we've still got great new stuff coming through that we can appreciate together. So I think that's what I'd like to flag up. And the other thing is that I'm sitting here in a small European country. You guys are sitting across the water in the States. And that gives me a slightly different perspective, I think, because my fandom is both close and distant at the same time.
Yeah, I definitely feel that as an Australian in the US. I mean, I did actually live in the UK for 5 years as well. We escaped just before the whole Brexit mess went down. So it's sort of, we've been jumping from country to country for a while. And yeah, so but going back to the Hugos, I think the other thing that sort of got lost in the not in the translation so much, but it didn't really come out until after the fact, was the way the Sir Julius Vogel Awards, which are New Zealand's sort of premier science fiction fantasy awards, just got ignored and sidelined because the Vogel contestants, or not contestants, that's the wrong word.
Winners.
Or the winners, yes, but also the people who were the nominees, that's the word I was grasping after, nominees, had all put together a packet that was meant to go out to the Hugo attendees, just the same as the Hugo works would. And it just sort of got buried. For whatever reason, the convention put like one tiny little reference to it, and you had to surf through however many pages to find a Google Drive and download it, which nobody knew to do. And then they put the awards ceremony itself on after the retro Hugos in the same time slot by the time everybody was asleep, and they didn't publicize it. So in a convention that was meant to be about the Antipodes, but specifically New Zealand, about that part of the world, there was no Maori really stuff that came through. There was not really a lot of emphasis on New Zealand at all, and I think that's a tremendous shame. And it was really quite devastating to find out after the fact that, oh, look, this element of it was right there. The nominees and the winners all put these wonderful packets together to share their work, and the committee just didn't distribute it for some reason. And I mean, I feel like the microcosm of all of this stuff having to go online is you're in two minds about it. Where, so my 7-year-old has just started, virtual academy yesterday, and on the one hand, I am immensely sympathetic to his new teacher, and everybody who's trying to do all of this stuff over the internet in ways that it hasn't been done before. And at the same time, this is a teacher now telling a class of 7-year-olds, oh, hey, don't raise your hand, type a question in the chat box. And it's like, they are 7. This is beyond them. And it feels like a microcosm of the Hugos, where it's like, yes, you're having to do an unprecedented thing. I have immense sympathy for the difficulties that you as an organizing committee have faced, especially having to do it on the fly, having to make the decision to take the con virtual. But at the same time, am I allowed to swear, by the way? Yeah, what the fuck?
From the inside, the view is not much better. I mean, Sir Julius Vogel, the story is extraordinary. And this guy was the first Jewish Prime Minister of New Zealand, and he wrote a utopian feminist novel in 1889. And, this is just extraordinary. Why have we never heard about him? Well, I'm sorry, Foz, you probably have because you're Australian, but I confess before a few weeks ago I hadn't. And this is.
I had never.
I hadn't particularly, I vaguely knew the name, but you have to understand that Australia is to New Zealand what America is to Canada, i.e. the slightly bigger, more evil neighbor.
I'm an Irishman who's become Belgian, so I understand this time.
Right. And to a certain extent, we've all been implicitly, but never explicitly, recognizing the biggest change in the last year is that because of the pandemic, travel restrictions, etc., conventions have all gone virtual. We had literally dozens of conventions that many of us were planning on going to, including the WorldCon, including this NASFiC, that are now turned into little boxes on a screen with very, very on-the-fly decisions about how we're going to make this work. We do not have the experience to tell us what is the best way to make it work. We are experimenting and redoing things on the fly. And it's not just, our 50-person or 500-person conventions. It's not even our world cons. Both San Diego Comic-Con and Dragon Con, which are the two large sort of non-commercial conventions in our field, have both gone virtual. We've already had San Diego, and Dragon Con is going to be next month, and it will be interesting to see how they solve the problem of how you make conventions work when instead of having a few hundred or even a few thousand, you're looking at 80,000 plus in the case of Dragon Con. I believe San Diego's at about 120, 130,000. So we've all had to accommodate on the fly and learn from the successes and failures of all of our predecessors and see how much we can change in the next 3 weeks from the stuff that we just learned 3 weeks ago doesn't work.
One of the things that I've attended now, I think like 4 or 5 or even 6 conventions virtually since they all started canceling. And one of the things that's an issue for me, so I have an invisible disability, which when I'm at a convention, you don't see, but it's also the half that you would see, you don't see because I'm sitting at home. And the half that you don't see is what's making it difficult for me because I am home. So being on Discord for multiple hours at a time, on each day, and typing your comments in, by the end of the day, my hands, that's part of my issue. My hands were like just these claws that I couldn't move anymore. And so if you have some sort of mobility issue or not a mobility issue, I don't know what to call it, but if you have some issues, say arthritis or some other joint issue, typing the entire convention is going to be difficult. On the other hand, it's going to be much easier for you to not have to travel, whether it's, a 2-hour flight or, switching from one airline to another airport to whatever it is that it's going to take you. And it's also more accessible because, like, for this convention, it's free, right? There have been a lot of other conventions that, even though they're still charging, they're charging a much more reduced rate. And so this whole COVID situation has made it both more and less accessible to people. It's also, I think, exacerbated some of the parochialism, I'm not sure if that's the right word, about North American fandom, because when I see the schedule in a time zone other than, Central or Eastern, everyone's up in arms like, wait, you want me to see a panel in the middle of the night? And there's no recognition that there's an entire rest of the world that has to get up and see a panel in the middle of the night if the entire schedule revolves around your time zone.
And that was something, if I could leap in there, that was something I thought there was the Con Zealand Fringe that I ended up getting invited to participate in. And I was on a couple of panels for that. And it was sort of not really part of Con Zealand, but off to the side. And it had come up to exist purely for the reason that you're describing, which is there weren't sufficient events on in time zones for people not in America, despite the fact that the con itself was meant to be, in New Zealand. So they were making events that were timed for people in Europe, people in Australia and New Zealand, people in just any other part of the world. But the time zone is a cruel mistress. It's something that, I have at least some, sympathy is the wrong word because it's for a process, but you can understand more readily why people default to the time zone that they are in, because it's the time zone that they are in. And particularly if you've got a majority of people in that time zone, like, yes, it still pays to think about, are we trying to make this, particularly in the case of a world con or,
exactly
what is meant to be a global event. If you're just like a handful of, if you're a smaller local convention that's going digital, then yes, of course, it kind of makes sense that you're sticking to that time zone. But then it still begs the question of, well, okay, ordinarily, if you were a small convention, people would still be coming from elsewhere to where you are. But now the else that you're coming to, the internet, is this liminal space where it both is and isn't in a particular time zone. It's just kind of where it is. It's where you are. Yeah. And if people are all talking from home, then nobody potentially is in the same time zone. So
I thought that Con Zealand, I would in part agree and in part disagree. Con Zealand, the times were tolerable for North America and sort of tolerable for New Zealand. the place that was in the absolute worst shape was Europe, because New Zealand right now is at +12, which means that you are completely out of sync with Europe, since Europe is for the most part in, plus small numbers, which means that you're 10 or 12 hours different. So you're completely out of cycle.
The Hugo ceremony ran from 1 in the morning until 4 in the morning, and that was quite a long 3 hours, it seemed to me at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, again, timed so that it was in the morning at an almost reasonable hour for New Zealand. It was in the evening or late afternoon, depending on where you were in North America. And Europe was absolutely hosed. There just is, it is unfortunate, but I agree completely. I don't think there is a solution to the time zone issue. You can't have given particularly where New Zealand, North America and Europe, it's relatively easy to find compromises that sort of work for most of Europe and most of North America. If you then have to throw New Zealand in, I was, when we had physical facilities and we're having a real physical convention, I was facilities division head. Now, my team was scattered from Europe, throughout North America, and extending as far as Melbourne. What that meant was there was no time when we could assemble the entire team for a multi-hour team meeting. So unless it was off at a convention where we were all likely to be there, we ended up having to hold a bunch of split meetings where, the Americans could meet with the Europeans and the Americans could meet with the ones in Australia and in New Zealand, but getting everybody together just really was not practical.
I think that's always been the case, though, with any Worldcon convention committee. My question is going to be, what is it that a luxury once had quickly becomes a necessity? And so while conventions are now accessible to people who would otherwise not be able to afford to fly to wherever it is, now that they have been able to have access, are we going to continue to have some sort of virtual aspect to conventions? And how do you navigate the fact that people are going to want it to be in their time zone? And the first part of that is, are conventions going to have something, period, regardless of what time zone it's going to be in? Are conventions going to continue having some virtual aspect to keep that access going? Or are they going to say, oh, well, the pandemic is over, so now we can just go back to in-person conventions and we're done?
I reckon it's, oh, sorry, Nicholas, you go.
Oh, you first.
Well, I was just going to say, I think they'll have to keep some of it, if only because I think one of the things that was highlighted by this very early on is across, and not just in fandom, but broadly, disability advocates saying, hey, we've been talking about work from home and we've been talking about digital accessibility for a long time. And the able-bodied community was like, no, we just don't want to do that. And then suddenly we had to do that. And the accommodations that had been asked for so long for so many people were suddenly available. So yeah, now we're in the digital thing and we're looking at, yes, here are other issues that we need to address, like having protections to make sure that racists don't get into random Zoom calls, which, the introduction of the lobby helped with that, as Ben was talking about in our pre-panel conversation. So there are new challenges that evolve with the digital stuff. And I think but one of the more positive things I think that's come out of this recently is that you are getting conventions that are starting in the digital era. So after the whole Hugo debacle, we've now, and George R. R. Martin failing to pronounce Fire magazine correctly, we've now got FireCon, which is the inaugural convention being held inaugurally online by Fire magazine, and they've started their own awards ceremony, which is the Ignite Awards. And I think that's amazing. And the fact, I think that's a really fantastic idea that you've got a group of people who are, in some respects, much more familiar with the kind of accommodations that should be made with technology, who have been very quick to look at the Hugo ceremony and say, well, here are the things that this convention did wrong. Here's the thing that this ceremony did wrong. Let's start our convention by fixing that in a digital sphere. And then presumably at some point, once the pandemic has passed, assuming a new evil doesn't rear up its head to keep us all in our houses indefinitely, we'll be able to progress from a digital realm to the physical. And I think that could be a really fascinating and interesting way for particularly more marginalized creators and convention runners and ideas like that to get off the ground by sort of testing the waters digitally and saying, do we have an audience for this content? Here's how we wrangle it in this space. Because even prior to now, a lot of the con running stuff has been digitally enabled in terms of, as Ben was saying, people around the world having to collaborate. So if you start off in a purely digital sphere and then you move to the physical, what's that going to look like for conventions?
Yeah.
Well, we started the process in some sense many decades ago with figuring out ways of accommodating that. Things like TAF were invented specifically in an attempt to, after Walt Willis was brought over on a special fan fund to Chi-Con in '52, people said, gee, it would be useful if we can get North American fandom and European fandom to familiarize themselves with each other. And yes, fanzines are great. Most of the contact is still going to be fanzines because it's a lot cheaper to send 30 pages of paper than to send a real person. But, you're looking at 70 years ago, we decided we needed to try and do things to bring people together. And as the technologies have evolved and changed the relative costs and, quite frankly, the relative income of fandom. In 1960, there was an enormous controversy when the Worldcon doubled in price. It went from $1 to $2. But even in constant dollars, you don't see that sort of cheap Worldcon anymore. But we've been developing new technologies, and usually they start out actually on the participatory side. Convention staffs start to become international. Convention guests and program participants start to become more international. And then the attendance starts to show those changes. I mean, the Worldcon went to its first non-English speaking country, although mostly everybody there did speak English, only in 1970 with Heidelberg. Before that, it had been in the UK and it had been in Canada.
And they do speak English in the UK, I understand.
It's certainly close to American. It's a language very similar to American. Mm-hmm. And although one of my favorite memories from a Worldcon was in Holland in 1990, we had an American fan from the Deep South with a very, very, very Southern accent. And we had a Scot with mostly Glaswegian, but a little bit of other traces of accent. And they were trying to speak to each other in English, and neither one of them understood a word that the other was saying until a Dutch fan came over and was who is a non-native English speaker, and he was translating from one native English speaker speaking English to another native English speaker speaking English. I love WorldCons.
Nicholas, you had something that I cut you off with before.
Yeah, I had two things. I mean, the first thing was to say that on the narrow point of the Hugos, that I was deeply dismayed by the way the ceremony unfolded and my efforts to get pronunciations, of which you're aware of, Foz, because you were one of the finalists this year as well. Somehow,
No, I wasn't this year.
Oh, I beg your pardon. But so, somehow the efforts we'd made did not get transmitted internally, and we're still kind of questioning internally how that happened. But the broader point I want to make is, and the mention of Walt Willis brings me back to it. And I grew up in the same city as Walt Willis in Belfast in the worst times because he was 50 years older than me. And for me as a teenager growing up in that situation, science fiction was awfully important as a way of escaping from this very, very narrow society with a very small-minded set of people doing small things, which sometimes has rather awful consequences for individuals, and to look at a wider culture. And I think fandom is at its best when it enables people to communicate beyond where they are at the moment, but also about where they are at the moment, and to broaden the horizons of everybody that comes into it. I think that's really important. And one of the things that I hope does not get lost in the new style of pandemics is that I hope that conventions both become a bit more global, as we've been discussing, but also retain their sense of locality. And that's quite important. And I don't resent the fact that, I whined about it a bit earlier, but of course the Hugo ceremony was going to be in the middle of the night for me when the convention's in Con Zealand. 2 years out of 3, the Hugo ceremony is in the middle of the night for me. But I follow it all the time anyway, because I'm like that. But I think that I don't think conventions should feel obliged to try and adopt a global timescale. I think instead they should adopt their own local characteristics and try and parlay that into a more global perspective. And I agree, I would have liked to have seen a bit more of that at the start of the month. And I think it's something, in a globalized society where everybody can jump in and out, you have to think, what's your local contribution going to be? What's the contribution you make from where you're sitting, both geographically and in terms of wider society. And I think that's where we add value. That's where we learn from each other.
Agreed. Very much agreed.
The WorldCon has traditionally always been a merger of two communities. It's been a merger of the local culture of the local area, the people who are part of the locale where the WorldCon is located. And they've developed a fanish culture because they're the ones who brought it to that location. And that's always merged with the tradition of what it means to be a WorldCon, which is in part vaguely written down, but is also carried forward by the community of people who attend and work on WorldCons, no matter where that WorldCon is. So that's always a tricky synthesis. And I am hopeful that as our communications tools continue to improve, that merger will be easier to accomplish, that you aren't going to be banging heads quite as often with a two cultures clash. But this also leads to, I guess, the second half of this panel, and that is, what do we see as, what are the trends that we are likely to see over the next few years, few decades? What effects are we going to see there? Foz, why don't we quickly go in the order that we started? So
I think it's going to be, I mean, a lot of it is going to depend on how quickly or not, as the case very well may be, the pandemic is resolved, and what we're sort of looking like as a community, both local communities and global communities, when we come out of it. Talking about sort of future Worldcon bids, for instance, I know people, and with reason, people were very upset with the prospect of a Jeddah bid. And on the one hand, yes, it would be lovely to have a convention in that part of the world and to bring in sort of Middle Eastern fandom. At the same time, it would have been an incredibly dangerous location to physically attend for queer people, for certain people of color, for women, basically, given some of the local rules. And people have the same criticisms now going forward when you're looking at what else has happened in 2020, saying, well, can we actually say that America as a convention location is safe for international fans, particularly people of color? Frequently, no, it's not. There's a bid for Chengdu in China. Can we say that China is safe for people to attend in terms of what could happen if you speak out about certain things, or if you are deemed to hold certain opinions? No, you can't guarantee that. And the cynical part of me wants to say, have you seen every government in the world? Like we can't be, you can't look around the globe and go, all right, where is the one true perfect government? I'd be inclined to point at New Zealand at this point in time and be like, yes, Jacinda Ardern will keep us all safe with her sensible policies and her lack of fascism. But on the one hand, yes, you do have to grapple with this, the terrible reality that not every country is going to be, like, there's not going to be a perfect country, but some problems are more pressing to attendees than others. And given I don't think you can really, I mean, this is a kind of dark arc to take things on, but I don't think you can extricate global political leadership from the pandemic at the moment. And when I'm talking about how conventions will look, or how fandom will look when we come out the other side of the pandemic, I think a large factor in that is, what are various governments going to look like? What are countries going to look like after this? Without getting too science fictional about it, the US is the obvious example to point to, but it is very, very apparent that the pandemic is changing how people react to their governments. And we have, I don't know if it's just this particular point in history, if we've reached a point where injustices suppressed for so long have built up and built up and built up, and finally are being publicly addressed. If it's a combination of that, plus the fact that so many people are out of work and can protest, if it's the fact that people are scared, and so various governments around the world are becoming more fascist, are becoming something else. And I think, this ties into fandom in the idea that, particularly with Nicholas talking about growing up in Belfast and the importance of science fiction and fantasy as a way to escape that, without wanting to insert science fiction, fantasy, and storytelling into the Maslow's hierarchy of needs regarding, wider political chaos, pandemics. These are times, I think, when stories and the community that we build around stories are particularly important, and that will continue to be important. And it is, I think it's all inextricably tied together. And so if we're looking at what will conventions look like, we still don't know what in some cases, given that large parts of America are currently on fire, much like most of Australia was on fire not that long ago, you're looking at it going, what's the actual landscape going to look like? Are there going to be certain cities that are going to not survive this? Are they going, or which will be drastically altered? I could go on in this vein for some time. Clearly, I'll let somebody else speak. But yeah, for me, I think that's all kind of knotted together.
Isabel?
So for me, a recurring issue is race and representation. This is not something new that just happened with Jeanette's Hugo acceptance speech last year. You know, I still have a very visceral physical reaction whenever someone says race fail. You know, that happened in 2009, and I hear that, and I remember that. I remember being involved. I remember feeling unsafe. I remember feeling really fucking angry. And every time that I think, or that people of color think, okay, finally, people are paying attention. This brought a light to this horrible thing that is happening. And so now we're going to be able to go forward and things are going to get better. And then it doesn't. And we're like, of course it's not going to get better. What the hell were we thinking? Right? Like we do this every time. It's like we hope and we get excited and we, you know, and sure enough, we're like, I can't believe I fell for it again. And so every time this happens, it's really frustrating. And this year with the horrific Hugo Awards, Hugo ceremony, not moderation, hosting, you know, is that finally the straw that breaks the camel's back? Is it because it happened during this pandemic, during this time of Black Lives Matter? You know, is this when it's finally really going to happen? Or will Robert Silverberg still be presenting at the Hugos next year? Right? Like, if that man doesn't disappear from fandom, I want to ask everybody why. Why the fuck is he still around? Right? So next year, is it really going to be different? Because I really want it to be. But I have seen this movie before and I know how it ends, right? And so how is fandom going to change next year? How are we going to take the lessons of what we have learned and learned again and learned again and apparently haven't actually learned? And how are we going to go forward with that, given that fandom is changing? The people who are winning the Hugo Awards are not old white guys anymore. Okay, that is the direction that fandom is going. We now have FIA, not FIA, FIA. Okay, we now have FIACon. We have the Ignite Awards. You know, we have a lot of young people in fandom. This is the direction. This is the future. And so when is fandom going to get on board with that? That's what I want to know.
It is very, just you talking about not learning. The two things that sprang to mind, one is Lucy continually pulling away the football from Charlie Brown.
Yes.
Yeah, that is how you every time you're like, yes, this time it's finally and then you're on your back and the football hasn't moved. And the other thing is telling my 7-year-old to stop clicking his Lego together when he sits in the lounge room. He'll sit there and it's just making this bang, 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 and you ask him to stop, and he'll stop for 2 seconds and then do it again. And it's this repeated thing where he doesn't even seem to notice that he's doing it. He's like, yes, I'll stop, and he'll say, I'll stop while he's doing it. But that feels,
Nicholas?
It's just such a real pleasure to do that, Foz. You know, how can you do that? Anyway, but look, we've talked a lot about the Hugo ceremony, and I think not enough about the people who actually won. And Isabel was kind of nudging in that direction. But I think it was a jolly good set of results.
yes,
in terms of the voting. And the speeches were absolutely fantastic from those who actually won. And I'm sure we've all seen the cut down version of the ceremony with just the speeches from the people who won rather than the other stuff, which is well worth watching. Worth pointing out, I think Max Gladstone was the first white man to have won a Hugo Award for about 5 years.
And I'm okay with that.
And I'm certainly okay with that. It's not like there was no historical imbalance to overturn or anything here. So I think that's really important. I think that on the one hand, it's depressing that we have to have these same arguments over again with people who we thought were on our side. But at the same time, I think the number of these arguments is probably going to decrease, even though it gets equally dispiriting to have to do them over and over again. So that's my sort of my sort of prediction. The other thing I wanted to say, totally on a different topic in the last 5 minutes, I think that streaming is really changing the way we're experiencing media. And this evening I just downloaded and watched the second episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, which I don't know if any of you have seen, but it's utterly fantastic. And used to be in the old days, everybody would sit down and watch the television at a particular moment, and we would all go, "Oh my God, he turned into the master." Sorry, Doctor Who reference for you guys. But now, we're all kind of storing it up for a couple of days, and Daenerys turned evil. Yeah, come on, we all knew that. I saw that on Facebook yesterday. That is changing our collective experience of how we're enjoying the media side of science fiction fandom. And I think we haven't yet worked through to the end of that. It's an interesting transition, and I slightly regret it on the one hand, because it was nice to have a collective experience of, oh my God, we all saw that last night. And at the same time, frankly, I'm a gentleman whose time is valuable to me, and I like the idea I can sit down and bloody watch it when I want to. So, that is a phase shift that has been happening and will continue to happen.
I actually have I have a whole rant about this, which I'm going to compress into
Peace.
very, very quickly. But the fact that the actual nature of the media itself has changed in accordance with the fact that we're no longer stuck to a TV schedule, because the whole idea of sitcom setups and procedural setups that you used, and genre setups you used to have, was you had to be able to have something that was potentially accessible to new viewers who hadn't seen the previous episodes or the previous season and had no way to catch up with them. So every episode had to potentially be an entry point. So it was really rare when you got like a 2 or 3 episode arc, because you had to be constantly able to invite new things in. But suddenly you then had DVD box sets, and I think that was when it started to change, when people realized, oh, like 24 was a huge thing in that. Oh, suddenly we can tell an ongoing narrative on the assumption that people will be able to catch up. And then streaming happened, and we went, oh, not only can we tell a story on the assumption that people can catch up, we can tell a story on the assumption that they can watch it now. And so it's not just the way we're reacting to the media, it's the structure of the media itself. And having just like binged and now rewatching The Untamed, which is a 50 episode long discrete Chinese fantasy drama, which is amazing. It's on Netflix if you want to watch it. But something like that I don't think could have existed that long ago, particularly when you look at where the episode breaks are. It's just a continuous narrative essentially across 50 episodes, and it suits the streaming era perfectly.
And I suspect the other big change is I expect the publishing industry to collapse over the next decade. Basically, books are moving from physical objects to collections of words. And the publishing industry has not recognized that change. Their pricing model is wrong. And their royalties are wrong. What it means is that an author can make far more money going indie rather than going to one of the big 5 by factors of like 5 and 10 on royalties per book. It means that the new authors are crazy to go to. It means that in many respects, I think the new authors are crazy to go to professional publishers. And I think they're going to recognize that. And we saw a presentation at the Nebulas 3 years ago that said that even 3 years ago, half of the books sold in our genre, by count, not by price, but half of the books sold in our genre were not coming out of the major publishers. They were coming out of indies. And it's just transitioning faster and faster. And what is the science fiction field going to be like when we lose a Tor, or when we lose a Daw, or when we lose any one of the companies that has given us great science fiction for many, many decades. And that is, I think, going to be a real change.
Jumping on that really quick, and I know we're not going to be able to talk about it, but just to suggest everybody go look at the hashtag What Publishing Paid Me. Foz, was that right? What Publishing
Yeah.
Paid Me. If you want to talk about publishing, that's a great thing to look at.
And
So.
we are out of time, so thank you all very much. And we will be going to the even chat to continue this if people are interested in following it.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you who presented content. And I will be putting up the sign right now. And everybody can move to the Olentangy Even chat room.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.